Hello and welcome to Anti-Natalism this week. Now, before we go ahead, just a warning. You might have guessed from the thumbnail that we are going to be talking about red button later on in the video. But before that, let's have a look at some news. Let's start with David Benatar. A new book is going to be out called Very Practical Ethics by David Benatar, as you can see on the screen. And I'm sorry, the actual links of the book are not working for me, so I had to make do with some snapshots of the book. Looking at the description of the book, it says that it is going to be talking about everyday problems that ordinary people face in their everyday lives. So no red button, no thought experiments, no trolley problems probably, and no specific specialized problems that people in certain professions face, but everyday life problems. Looking at the table of the contents, it says it's talking about sex, environment, smoking, giving aid to charity and so on, consuming animals, language, humor, bullshit, forgiveness, and conclusion. So I'm curious to know how much of this relates to antinatalism specifically, because it's going to be written by David Benatar. And I think possible candidates would be sex, then environment, if you're talking about ecological antinatalism. Giving aid might be if you're talking about effective altruism and things like that. Consuming animals could be one other possible candidate where antinatalism might come in. So eager to know where antinatalism pops up. So interesting book. And as you can see on the screen, it's going to be available for about $35. And I think there is an ebook also available. Once the link starts working for me, I'll probably try and update once more and also try to see if I can get access to the book also. Last week, we looked at a new book called On Extinction, Beginning Again at the End by Ware. They have written a new article called The Sickness of Life on the Problems with Antinatalism. The article is more of a criticism on certain flavors of antinatalism. They start with ethical, human-centric antinatalism. The article says that the problem with antinatalism is not that its pessimism is too radical, but rather that its pessimism isn't radical enough. And this is because it says that antinatalism does not consider the misery caused by structural issues of human society. So it says, while antinatalism harps on the pains of existence, anxiety, boredom, melancholy, loneliness, chronic disease, bereavement, it has nothing to say about how human misery is unequally distributed along lines of class, race, gender, and geography, or how it might be exacerbated by such trifling matters as the relentless exploitation of labor, crippling inequality, or the continued expansion of a permanent war economy. The second point it makes is antinatalists enjoy wallowing in their own pessimism. And so it says, unhappiness, we might say, always has a hole in it. And it is through this hole that happiness and enjoyment emerge as a kind of libidinal leakage or affective ooze. Now, this is ironical because pessimism is supposed to be a stand against pleasure or happiness or optimism. And so the article says this is precisely what antinatalism cannot grasp, or perhaps does not want to know. It does not see that pessimism is the fixed point around which its own enjoyment circulates. And thirdly, and to my surprise, the author brings up why don't you kill yourselves argument. The author says, if strictly speaking, the antinatalists should seek to return to source as quickly as possible, then why, we might ask, do they carry on living? Is it not because the surplus satisfaction found in their own bleak worldview is itself a precious treasure that they wish to protect at all costs? Before we go further, I just want to review these 3 points. I don't think antinatalism ignores the misery caused by the structural issues within human society. That there is a lot of injustice in the world, that there is a lot of inequality, wealth inequality in the world, almost to the degree of embarrassment, is considered within antinatalism. When antinatalists talk about state of the world, when they ask why should I bring a child in this kind of the world, part of that state of the world refers to these structural issues in human society. As for the wallowing in their own pessimism as a source of happiness, I think there is a degree of truth in it. It's partially true. If you go and look at the internet forums and the posts that antinatalists make on those forums and the memes they post, you can say that, yeah, they are enjoying putting all these negative and pessimistic memes. But that is a consequence of the state of the world that these antinatalists are living in, rather than the arguments for antinatalism. And thirdly, I don't even need to address why don't you kill yourself argument. But just for the completeness, I would say that antinatalism is against creation of new life, starting new life. It is not for killing or ending existing life. I am surprised that an author of this caliber, who can write in such a flowery language, even brings up this kind of argument. Moving on, the author refers to environmental or ecological antinatalism, and then they also refer to Lee Edelman's 2004 No Future book, in which they propose a theory. They say that child or children in general is a symbol of future generations, and we should reject that. And the way to reject that is that they propose a queer theory, in which they say that we should reject all of this through what they call as death drive. The author says that both of these theories and movements, the ecological antinatalism and Lee Edelman's death drive and queer theory, are as self-destructive as capitalism itself. And then they pour in more criticism on ecological antinatalism. Firstly, they say that ecological antinatalism partially stems from Western pathology of species shaming. And then they say because capitalism has eliminated meaning in individual life and individuality itself, ecological antinatalism is rather a response or a reaction to this desire of dying meaningfully. And finally, they say that ecological antinatalism is as heroic, implying that it is as hollow as transhumanism itself. They say that the affirmation of human self-extinction is just as heroic as any form of tech utopianism that claims that it too can solve all of nature's problems. So this article completely ignores the core arguments of sentiocentric ethical antinatalism. This article, I think, is a very good example of a beautifully written bad article on antinatalism. So after recording my summary video about Ben Ware's article, I found out that there was an article summarizing that article in Spanish language, which I got translated through Google Translate. And as you can see on the screen, this is the article, Ben Ware More Pessimistic Than Antinatalists. And I read through the summary, and more or less it seemed to coincide with what I said. There might be some differences. I am not going to summarize the summary again, but you can have a look and read through and see what you think. So of the notable videos this week, there is one by Tofu Dog, and she is reviewing Antinatalism, Rejectionist Philosophy from Buddhism to Benatar by Ken Coetis or Ramesh Mishra as we know it. It was a very good video. I think that Tofu Dog's channel deserves more subscribers and more views. So very good. And looking at the comments, it looks like she's also going to review other books like Better Never to Have Been. So looking forward to that. Lawrence did a live stream addressing to different aspects and topics which Acharya Prashant covers. Acharya Prashant is a Indian spiritual teacher, preacher in India. And I would not comment on the contents of the video because it's a more than 2 hours long video. Very good video. But more than that, looking at the comments, it looks like Lawrence was trolled a little bit. And this is the case with India. And I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations about India and Indians here. That's because I think I know more about India than any other country. India is a thriving market for spiritual preachers. Anybody who wears the cloak of spirituality, they don't have to be religious. Just the word spirituality has some appeal within Indians. And then through that, you can preach whatever you want. Acharya Prashant is doing that for antinatalism, veganism. I'm not saying that he's using spirituality only to preach this, but he does talk about these two things, in favor of these two things, and antinatalism and veganism. Although his main, I should not say business, but his main goal or his main profession or his main work is to preach about spirituality. And people then, they become disciples rather than followers. And then anybody who disagrees with their preacher, they go and troll it. This is the problem with India and Indians at the moment. I'm not saying it's the problem only with India. Maybe there are other countries also, but it is definitely a problem with India. And Lawrence seemed to have got some heat of it. But anyway, still nice effort. There was a discussion about antinatalism, a debate/discussion on the topic of antinatalism with Elias by Lawrence. So Elias is he doesn't agree with antinatalism. Some of the points, I'm not going to talk about each and every detail because it's again a 2-hour long video, you can watch it. But some main points which are brought up there was that one is about intrinsic value of consciousness, that we don't know, and consciousness can have an intrinsic value similar to the way we treat suffering having a negative intrinsic value. So consciousness or existence, being into a conscious existence might be a positive intrinsic value, which can then act against antinatalism, is one of the claims of Elias. The other one is maybe along with this intrinsic value of consciousness, one of the reasons why all of these conscious being exists might be because there is some really cosmic grander meaning to all of this, whatever is happening on the earth. And if we go with the antinatalism line, there is a risk of not fulfilling that cosmic meaning if there ever exists such a cosmic meaning. I thought this line of argument was similar to Pascal's wager that, you it is better to believe in God even if there might not be any God, because if there is a God and you don't believe it and you die, then you're going to suffer. But if there isn't a God and you still believe it, you die, it's not harmful. So it's rather better to believe in God. That is the outline of Pascal's wager, and this argument seems to be in line with that. There were many things other than this discussed. They went back and forth about David Benatar's asymmetry, but I think most of the things which they discussed has been discussed in other places, in other papers and videos also. They also talked about some aspects of advocacy of antinatalism, whether advocating for antinatalism would be dangerous. And this is also something which has already been addressed by David Benatar in chapter 6 on population and extinction. But overall, interesting video, a 2 hour debate, back and forth discussion. Always an interesting discussion, at least for somebody like me. So Lawrence made a video saying why antinatalists should stop talking about the red button. So we talked about the red button. I discussed that with Lawrence. Let's see how that discussion went.
Okay, yeah, I can summarize what I said. I need to remember what I said now. um, yeah, I can summarize what I said, and then we can just go through your notes because then you'll bring up everything that you wanted to discuss anyway. Um, so, do you want me to summarize it now? Should I just go straight into it?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, I've just done a video on why I think antinatalists should basically leave the red button thought experiment by the wayside when it comes to discussions on antinatalism. So, I've actually seen in the comments section of my video, whilst I haven't replied to every comment because that would just take so much time, I have seen that a lot of people have misunderstood what I've said. So, um, I'm not saying that the red button thought experiment doesn't have any use at all in any context, but I think I've seen it deployed in discussions around antinatalism, and I think one, it doesn't really add anything to the conversation on antinatalism, and I think two, it encourages confusion about what antinatalism is. And when I say that, I think it encourages a confusion between pro-mortalism and antinatalism. Um, and again, that's not to say that pro-mortalism is wrong per se. It's just saying it's different from antinatalism. Um, so just to summarize the main points that I made in that video, if I'm remembering correctly, are that the red button thought experiment, fundamentally why it's not about antinatalism, is because it asks the question of, would you be willing to end all lives to be able to achieve your desired outcome, right? Which to me is very different from what antinatalism is about. A second reason is that this red button thought experiment, it, I've only ever seen it being brought up in conversations around antinatalism, but it can be applied to anything. And I give some examples in the video, like of sex trafficking or slavery. I've never heard anyone talk to someone who's advocating against sex trafficking and said, oh well, would you go as far as to press a red button to achieve your aims or whatever. And then there are a few other things I said, like I proposed an alternative. I said I think it confuses antinatalism and pro-mortalism, and it confuses it for people who are trying to understand antinatalism. I think it gives people. I think it's unnecessarily inflammatory because it's asking someone if they would essentially sign off on genocide. Well, not genocide because that's a specific ethnic group, but I think the word is omnicide. Um, when I really don't think you need to go that far when you're trying to understand how the other person thinks about antinatalism. But I think that is by and large what I spoke about. So yeah, we can just go from whatever you want to talk about, Tejas.
Okay, let's talk about red button. Now, no, thanks for this, Lawrence, and of course, thanks for the earlier video as well. Some of the things I thought was the main point was the red button is not useful, and the red button is counterproductive, and then
Mm.
the red button is not brought in other problems. And then finally, you also talked about some alternatives to red button.
Mm. Yeah.
And I thought I should explore these three or four points. One part I want to explore is whether it is really not useful or not. And secondly, if that is an enough reason for us not to address red button.
Mm.
So, in terms of utility, you spoke about the red button doesn't really tell us anything about antinatalism itself,
Mm.
because antinatalism is not about ending existing life, whereas red button is about. And all it can tell us is the convictions of antinatalist rather than the arguments for antinatalism.
Yes.
Right, that was one. Now, a few points on that. One is that the red button tells you on the scale of all the ethical problems and ethics that one holds,
Mm.
where does one stand in terms of antinatalism? So, of course, I agree, it tells more about the antinatalist than antinatalism, but it still tells that about antinatalists, and that in itself, I think, isn't that valuable. Do you think?
So, do you mean it gives us information about where the anti-natalist prioritizes anti-natalism on the list of ethical issues that we should be addressing?
Uh, that plus it gives us an idea of the urgency that the antinatalist feels about this issue.
Right. So I think so. In answer to your question, yes, I think if the question that someone gives to the red button thought experiment will give you some information to those things, but it will also you'd have to I don't think it would give you it on a silver platter. You'd really have to ask further questions because if someone says, for example, that they would press the red button because they're an anti-natalist and they want to end all lives in pursuit of preventing any future births, um, that could tell you about the urgency, but you'd also have to ask further questions about um, you know uh, how do they view death, for example? Do they view death as a harm? Because if they don't view death as a harm, then it wouldn't really be that big a deal to them. Whereas if they view death as a harm, then it would be a massive deal for them to press the red button. So I think I agree with you that it would give and I even say this in the video, it doesn't tell you anything about the principles, but it tells you how far someone's willing to go for the principles.
Yeah,
So I do say in the video that I agree with you here.
yeah.
But I think you would need to ask further questions to actually get a full answer
Mm.
to what you want to know.
Right, right. And that actually, it's good that you brought up death in that, because on an individual level, the equivalent question is, why don't you kill yourself
Mm,
if you don't want to start a new life?
yeah.
And the general response, or what we would recommend, is to answer that question, to face that question and answer it and say that it is not about ending existing life.
Mm.
So our response to that question seems to be different than our recommendation for red button. My point is,
S-
whether red button is good or not, whether we would press it or not, is a different
mm,
thing. But um, if we are facing the question of why don't you kill yourself, we are taking that up. We should also take
mm,
up the questions on a higher species level, or the human level, or the life level. You know what I mean?
mm. Yeah, so I guess this will depend on the person. So, if someone posed both of those things to me, if they posed why don't you kill yourself and the red button, if someone directly asked me those, then I would answer their question. It's not like I would just say, no, I'm not talking about that. Let's move on. The point of my video was that I don't think it's a useful thing for us to actively be bringing up. If someone asks you it directly,
Hmm.
then, if you want to dodge the question, that's up to you. Or if you want to answer it, that's up to you. So
Hmm.
that wasn't really what I was talking about in the video. But if someone asked me about, you know, why haven't I killed myself, I, and the red button, I think I would answer them in pretty much the same way, I would say the fact you're asking me that question means that you fundamentally misunderstand what antinatalism is about. Because just because I think that it would have been better never to have come into just because I think it would have been better never to have come into existence doesn't mean that I want to end my own life. Likewise, just because I think it's better to not to come into existence, it doesn't mean I want to end all lives, if you get what I mean. So I'd answer them in pretty much the same way.
Right, right, right. I agree with you that we should not be bringing up actively in terms of, like, if you're having stop having kids campaign, you should not be actively going on the
Yeah.
streets and say, I'm going to press red button without anybody asking you. That I agree. But when we are, like when an academic literature is being produced or a book is being
Mm,
written or even a serious video is being done. So one analogy I can think of is in case of vegan or plant-based or animal rights scenarios, um, Stranded Island is a famous thought experiment.
mm.
That if you're stranded on, the experiment.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
just for anybody who doesn't know, if you're stranded on an island with a pig and nothing else, would you
Mm,
eat that pig? Is an experiment put up by those who are defending eating meat.
mm.
And thought experiments usually try and evaluate your intuitions. Those are the tools to bring out your intuitions. I think Daniel Dennett said this. So there is an analogy there. Now, um,
Mm.
I don't think when you're doing vegan outreach, you should rather put posters about stranded islands. But when you're writing about it, so for example, if I remember correctly, Tom Regan in his Animal Rights, the case for animal rights,
Yes.
has this section about, he talks about the stranded island. If I remember rightly, I might be wrong.
Mm.
The point is, at in those places, should those red button experiments also be brought up so that these intuitions could be evaluated, at least. Um,
Yeah, so I think if someone um, writes an article about the red button or something like that, um, I don't think antinatalists should necessarily ignore it. Like I said, if someone asks us about the red button, I think it's completely fine to give a response. The response I'd advise is if someone asks you about the red button, I think the first thing you should say to them is, what information are you hoping to get out of my answer to this question? Because then that will enlighten you as to whether they've actually understood if it's relevant to antinatalism or if it's only relevant to your tolerance for ending the lives of others, right? To achieve your ethical ideals. So I think that's an important first thing to ask. Depending on their answer is then going to change how you obviously move forward with the conversation. But to talk about what you also said about should we discuss the red button willingly and bring it up so that we can sort of test people's intuitions? I think this can be interesting in a. I think it depends what intuition. First of all, it depends what intuitions you're talking about. So I'm not sure it would give us any information about our intuitions that are relevant to antinatalism. Um, but I'm open to there being some. I might be wrong on this, which is why at the end of my video I said, look, if you disagree with me, put in the comments. Um, so yeah, I'm yet to kind of see what intuitions it would test that would be relevant to antinatalism rather than the individual person's propensity for ending lives. Um, and the other thing is, I think if we do want to test our intuitions with the red button, it would probably be best to start by doing that in very private areas, um, and discussing it in private conversations and stuff like that until we're really sure that it actually has real value. Because if I mean, maybe the damage is already done, because like the red button has been spoken about ad nauseum online. I know many of those videos will have been taken down, but there will still be some up there. But I think a lot of the discussion around the red button that I've seen to date, and obviously I haven't seen all of it, has been what I view as quite sloppy. Like it's brought up because it's a catching sort of thought experiment. It sounds cool, and people like to ask it because they want to push things really far. And I can understand that because it's fun to do that sometimes. But often when I see it deployed in a conversation, I'm thinking, how is this actually relevant to the conversation, really? Um, so I think it can be fine to bring up if you want to test intuitions. as long as the intuitions are actually relevant to antinatalism, and also just be wary about what situation you're doing it in, and also think, are there any less controversial ways of testing those intuitions, like the alternatives I give in the video about comparing Earth to Mars, and a button that removes suffering but doesn't, commit you to killing everyone. So yeah.
So I think there are two or three routes why red button. I mean, we reach out to red button. One
Mm.
is that when we are talking about antinatalism, extinction is at least a theoretical consequence we have to face.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
whether you think it as a consequence, a tolerable consequence, or whether you think it as a goal, in both
Mm.
cases, extinction is present in the conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
And then what extinction would mean is that you are okay for this place to be devoid of either life or humanity, depending on what kind of antinatalist you are.
Yeah.
So if you're okay with that, then would you be okay if, and I'm talking about the instant vanishing variation of the red button here,
Mm.
would you be okay if instantly everybody vanishes and there's no physical or mental suffering happening because nobody knows that they're just going to go in an instant? So it comes through an extinction route. That's one I can think of. The other
Yeah.
route, of course, is negative utilitarian route, that if you just want to
Yeah.
avoid all the suffering, okay, prevent all the suffering of create by not creating new beings, but the existing beings are still going to suffer in their rest of the life.
Mm.
So if you use this vanish variation of red button, you still avoid that rest of the suffering. Now it depends on whether you consider that suffering or saving of that suffering outweighing the other values like
Mm.
autonomy and rights and preferences and so on. So it depends. The answer depends on what your preferences are. And the third route I can think of is if you're a sentiocentric antinatalist,
Yeah.
where you're saying that it would be better if there is no sentient being existing on this earth. And this also ties into your alternative where you are comparing earth and Mars. So I
Mm.
know there you are suggesting only the comparison, but that sort of raises a question like, okay, you are proposing this, but how are you going to achieve this Mars state on the earth?
Yes, but I think so. That question about how are you going to achieve, I don't think that's part of antinatalism, right? Antinatalism is just an it's an ethical position on something, but how are you actually going to realize that is a separate question, right? So um, if we, for example, I don't know, anti-slavery, right? If you ask the vast majority, if you ask everyone, the vast majority of people say yes, I'm ethically against slavery, right? But just because they're ethically against slavery hasn't committed them to also being for some specific route towards that, right? Like that's a separate question, the actual route towards it. Now it will be informed by their opposition to slavery, but I don't think being opposed to something on ethical grounds necessarily means that as part of that, there's a roadmap laid out on how to get there, right? I think the roadmap has to be layered on top of the ethical position, but it's not part of the ethical position itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
I sort of agree. I was just saying where this red button
Right, where it comes
comes from.
from.
Right?
Yeah.
It comes from this question like how the first thing is, okay, if we
Yes.
turn to Mars instantaneously, what happens? And then how?
Well, no, but that's not, it's not about if we turn to Mars instantaneously. It's comparing, right? It's
Yeah,
comparing the two states.
that's
Um,
that's the first statement. Yeah, and this is a
yeah.
different statement. There's a leap in between.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
I get that.
And and also I wanted to say a quick bit on the extinction and the negative utilitarianism. So obviously I know you're just presenting these as ways that people might be getting to the red button
Yeah,
from antinatalism, right? So I'm not saying this in response to you. I'm saying it in response to the points.
yeah,
So the first one about extinction is yes, bar some sort of radical life extending technology, antinatalism in with the negative duties that come from that of not procreating will result in extinction, right?
yeah.
But And I think this is widely recognized in antinatalist circles. There are different forms of extinction. Obviously, there's dying out extinction, but there's also killing off extinction, right? And those are two very different things. Antinatalism will only lead to dying out extinction. The red button deals with killing off extinction, and those are two very, very different things. So I understand why people see antinatalism, they see extinction, they see the red button, and they lump them all together. But I just wanted to pass those two things out very quickly. On the negative utilitarianism, I understand that for many people, negative utilitarianism and antinatalism intersect, but they aren't obviously the same thing. So you can get to an antinatalist conclusion using negative utilitarian logic, but just because you can get to both antinatalism and the red button using negative utilitarian logic doesn't mean that the red button and antinatalism are necessarily linked. They're just stemming from the same core set of principles, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
that's what I say on each of those three.
Right, right. I also, I actually want to come to the part where you say antinatalism is not the end state ideology.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but before that, and I might be repeating myself, but just want to make it clear that David Benatar talks a lot about death, whether it
Mm,
is in Better Never to Have Been or whether it is in the Human Predicament. He talks about death even more, and that's death of an individual. And then you get into scenarios of how that death happens, the process of dying, which one of the options of process of dying would be dying instantaneously.
mm.
That is also addressed in the human predicament, and he says that is bad as well because of blah blah reasons, because it's annihilation
Annihilation. Yeah.
and preference frustration and so on. But my point is, it's addressed. Benatar is not responding to anybody. He himself has brought these points up in case of individual death.
Mm,
Now, in the same light, I would be very happy if he writes on red button, but
yeah.
isn't that analogous that on an individual death, if you write so much, you can build up a case writing about red button on a species level or on a life level?
Do you mean a case for pushing it or a case for talking about it in the context of antinatalism?
So, in case of Benatar, he has opposed the individual death. He says death is bad. Even
Yeah.
if you kill somebody instantly, it is bad for that
Mm,
particular person, is what his
yeah.
position is. Analogously, he can build a case that pushing the red button, even if it is instant vanishing, is still bad. And
Yeah, which I think he talks about in his recent interview with
with
George Martin, right?
yes, yeah, carnism debunked. Correct.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's his opinion. But my point is, in the case of human predicament and in the case of individual death, he has written
Mm.
it actively.
Oh, right. So you mean he is discussing. So if I'm understanding what you're saying is he is discussing topics that aren't specifically antinatalism, but they're related. They are, seem to be related to it. And so if he's doing that, what's the harm in doing the same with the red button?
Yes.
Okay, so I think when David Benatar, and you probably know it better than me, so correct me where I'm wrong. When he discusses death, he uh, I don't know if he says this explicitly, but it's sort of implicit in what he's saying is that this is a separate conversation to antinatalism. The only way, maybe not the only way, but the only way that's coming to my mind at the moment that death is related to antinatalism is that if you believe death is a harm, it's one of the harms included in the harms of coming into existence, right?
Yes.
So that is how that would relate. But apart from that, discussions on the ethics of death or the philosophy of death or however you want to put it, like obviously I think it's fine for antinatalists to discuss multiple um topics, right? So if someone wants to discuss antinatalism and death, then they can discuss those two things. Obviously, they're free to do that, but they just need to make sure that they're not causing any confusion that the two are linked, unless they make clear how they are linked. Like what I was just saying there, with death being a harm, blah blah blah. The same can be true of the red button. If Benatar wants to write an article on the red button, I see no issue with that. The only reason I see it as an issue is if he is writing it um, and conflating it with antinatalism. And this is one of the confusions I think people got in the comments responding to my video, is that I'm not saying for antinatalists to never discuss the red button. What I'm saying is, in conversations about antinatalism, it doesn't seem to be relevant to me, and so I think we should leave it by the wayside. And I would say the same to Benatar. Like, if he publishes an article on the red button, that's completely fine. It would be interesting. But if he's publishing on the red button and saying that that is part of antinatalism, then unless he lays out very good reasons, I'd then take issue with it. If
Right.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we can go on, but I just want to move on to that the end state part.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said that antinatalism is not an end state ideology,
Yeah.
right? But if you look at Benatar, I'm coming back to Benatar, even Mati,
Yeah.
but let's look at Benatar first. So in Better Never to Have Been, there's a whole chapter dedicated for extinction, population and extinction,
Yeah.
right? And if you look at some snippets, he says, while talking about population, Benatar says, the central question of population is how many people should there be? And my answer to this question is zero.
Yeah.
And in another place, he says, here he's talking about the cumulative number of humans that have existed and that will exist in future. And in that context, he says many might wish to focus on a question of how many more people there may be in the cumulative sense rather
Mm.
than at some specified time in future. And the ideal answer here again is zero.
Yeah.
This to me, at least I to me it seems like he is in some way addressing the end state, if not prescribing how the end state should be.
So I think there's a difference when you're discussing it, when you're discussing extinction as part of antinatalism. There's a difference between it being a consequence and a goal, right?
Mhm.
So someone may be an antinatalist and an extinctionist. And to be honest, for anyone watching, because I know I personally have friends who I think maybe find my position on this annoying, and I do understand, because I think it is very nitpicky, and it's almost a distinction without a difference, or a difference without distinction, however you put it. But um, I think there is a philosophical difference between extinction being a goal, or a part of antinatalism, and it being a consequence. Um, and I think, I mean, I would have to go back and read Better Never to Have Been again to get the full context of these quotes.
Mhm.
But those quotes to me seem completely in line with Benatar talking about extinction as a consequence of antinatalism, right?
Yeah.
And I know that in his book, he does explicitly say that a killing off extinction, which would also achieve, a zero future people, is bad, and he's against that.
Yeah.
So that would make me think that he's talking more about a dying off um, extinction, which is more a consequence of antinatalism, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. I actually don't. I mean, we can get back on after both of us go through that chapter 6 again, because
Yeah.
there's a lot to digest there. But I don't think, at least as far as that chapter is concerned, he's talking or he's addressing extinction only as a consequence. But
Right.
but even then, let's, for the sake of argument, accept that we take it as a consequence. I think that
Mm.
consequence should still be addressed seriously.
Yeah, no, I agree, because I think it's like, when I mean, maybe it's not directly analogous, but when, if we're talking about veganism, people say, oh well, if we all became vegan, then the animals would just be overtake the earth, blah blah blah, right? So even though obviously that is a lot more stupid than someone's concern about, if we're all stop having children, then we'll go extinct, because that will happen, whereas animals aren't overrunning the earth, that wouldn't obviously happen. But the fact that people bring these up, I agree. We should deal with them. We should talk about them. Um, I just don't know how, if we're going back to the red button, how the red button would contribute to that discussion. Because again, when people bring up extinction with antinatalism, especially in this context, they would be talking about dying off extinction rather than killing off extinction.
Right. I just want to, since you brought up veganism, so this website, Viva, it seems to be an animal welfare or animal rights, I don't know, some website
Yeah,
which is concerned
they're
about animals.
Yeah. They're one of the biggest animal organisations in the UK. They're based out of Bristol. They're very active in the UK. So yeah, I
Right,
know them.
right. And they have this article, an year-old article. Do vegans want farmed animals to go extinct?
Mm,
And if you scroll down, so on the next page, they actually talk about these creatures which are bred by us for as farmed animals. They will go extinct, and they say, then so be it. That is okay. But before that, they also answer just the sentence before that paragraph, they already answer the prospective question, a red button equivalent question in this case. They
yep.
say that that is not to say we ought to exterminate these animals, quite the contrary.
Yep.
So my point is, red button experiment or equivalent arguments are
Mm.
brought in the scenarios of other problems when the problems are stretched at a universal level.
Yeah. Well, kind of. I don't think so in this case, right? Because they're preemptively saying this is not what we mean, right?
Yeah,
They're not writing an article saying if there was this hypothetical red button that we could push and it would end all lives on earth, so therefore there would be no more animals exploited. That's not something that they're like, because and they're in fact they're explicitly saying the opposite. They're saying we're not talking about killing animals off, we're talking about simply essentially ceasing to procreate, but procreate the animals, and then they die off. And so I think personally, and I don't know if I'm just twisting this in my head to be convenient, but personally I think they're saying the exact same thing that I was saying in the video.
they are preventing the red button scenario to be asked in the first place. Is that what you mean?
Exactly, yeah, they're
Yeah, okay.
preemptively bringing it up so someone doesn't bring up this hypothetical. Yeah.
Red button. Yeah, that also is one way to look at it. Yeah, I agree. But
Convenient for me.
now, but the point I wanted to make was that the problems that you had presented in the video, like sex
Mm,
trafficking or other problems, they were relatively local problems in the sense of antinatalism is probably one of the biggest universal problems or universal solutions, the way you look at it. I can't think anything bigger than, you know, no being there, anything bigger than no life being there. Um,
well, remember, antinatalism is specifically about not coming into existence.
mm,
So if if antinatalism were to be realized, it would simply mean that there are no more beings coming into it. Well, it depends on your definition of antinatalism, but it would mean that there are no more, at least on the minimal level that all antinatalists agree on, it would mean that there are no moral agents bringing any beings into existence anymore, right?
mm,
So, and that would achieve an antinatalist world if we restrict it to the core bit of antinatalism we all agree on, but there would still be beings in existence.
yeah.
So it's you've turned off the tap, but there's still water in the bath kind of thing, and someone could say that turning off the tap is the biggest bit to do, but there would that and that would realize antinatalism, but that wouldn't solve. And again, it depends on your ethical worldview. But if you view beings continuing being in existence, especially if they're ones that suffer a lot and don't have moral agency, then you would still see a moral issue with there being, existence. So it I don't think it's as universal as so I think that you're prescribing it as universal, but that's because you're lumping together the very things that I was saying we should separate, if you
Uh,
get what I mean.
yeah, no, I just want to give a little clarification. If I
Yeah.
remember, this was like years ago when Amanda was interviewing David Benatar, and she
Mm.
said, "This is the biggest issue in the universe." And Benatar said, "What do you mean? I don't think this is the biggest issue." And what I think what she meant at the time, and what I also mean here is that we should not bring new beings into existence, even if the
Mm.
consequence of that is eventually we'll have a world where no life is there or no sentient life is there.
Mm.
That's the statement, but the underlying to that is that because it would how do I word it? It would have been better had we not come into existence,
Yes, yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
the beings which are existing today, we are saying that it would have been better had they also not come into existence.
Yes.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but we have to remember as well that, because you were saying, if we stop bringing new beings into existence, then it will lead to a universe where there's no sentient beings anymore. But that's actually not the case, because most of the sentient beings that come into existence aren't brought into existence by us, right? So we bring humans into existence and domesticated animals, but we don't bring wild animals into existence. So if we define antinatalism as not bringing new sentient beings into existence, then it there would still be sentient beings coming into existence. And there would be, you'd need a further step to say we should intervene, right? Now this gets into tricky territory, because some people say that intervening in the lives of others is part of antinatalism, and some people say it isn't. Personally, I don't think it is. That's not to say it's wrong. I personally do think we should intervene in the wild and help wild animals. I just think it's separate from antinatalism, which I've said before in other
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah.
So,
But
yeah.
that is not my point. I can say coming into sentient existence is harmful, right? Whether
Mm, yeah.
whoever is bringing them into existence,
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
right? And in that sense, then it includes the future beings as well as the beings who have come into existence, and
Yes.
therefore it encompasses the entire sentient universe.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah.
In that sense, I meant universal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I agree, and in that sense, I'm exactly the same as you. But I think to fully get to antinatalism, as I think most people understand it, I think that's an important part. But another important part is then the negative duty that comes from that, of I should not be bringing any new sentient beings into existence. Like, with veganism, one important part of it is to recognize the moral value of other sentient beings, but an also important part is the negative duty that comes with that, of don't participate in their exploitation or owning them as property and this sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that was a discussion. Thank you to Lawrence for coming here and providing the clarification. There were some main points to take away. The biggest point was that, in Lawrence's opinion, red button is not within the realms of antinatalism. You can talk about red button as a related subject, you can talk along with antinatalism, but red button in and of itself does not fall within the arguments for antinatalism. That was his main point. Now, when you talk about red button as a related subject along with antinatalism, the question comes up: when do you do that, and when to not do that? There are two extremes to start with. One extreme is when you're doing a street activism like stop having kids. Of course, red button is not a good starting point over there. On the other hand, when there is academic literature produced by philosophers like David Benatar, red button can and should be discussed as at least a related topic. But there are many scenarios which fall within this range, somewhere in the middle. And what do we do there? And one case can be put forth that we can evaluate the utility of red button against the harmfulness of discussing red button, against the damage to the PR of antinatalism that red button thought experiment can do. For example, if there are some antinatalists who are discussing some nuanced, detailed topics seriously in a closed room, they can bring up red button thought experiment and discuss that. But then that meeting might be recorded, put on internet, and there is always a chance that somebody runs away with it, saying that antinatalists are mass murderers, they just want to commit mass murder. This has happened in the past. So in which scenario should we discuss red button and which scenario should we not is very tricky, it's very difficult. I don't think there is a straightforward formula to it. Lawrence's side, I think, is that just not to take that risk and not to discuss at all. So those are the two different sides. What do you think? Which side you are on? Let me know in the comments.